Today I want to talk about Book 10 of Plato's Republic. At this point, Glaucon and Socrates are discussing art and literature. And it turns out that Socrates says there is no place for art, there is no place for literature in the ideal state. Now, I think that's a shocking conclusion for them to draw. In fact, Socrates seems to be flying in the face of a very long-standing cultural assumption that we can evaluate a civilization in part by looking at its cultural products, its art, its literature. And this is something that Socrates utterly rejects. He says, no, they're actually damaging to a civilization, they're damaging to a culture, they're damaging to the state. Now, why does he think this is true? It really depends on the background of the theory of forms and his overall picture of reality. So the idea is this: the forms are these abstract things. Abstract things is already a bit of a misnomer. They're really abstractions that are what things of a kind have in common. So, for example, eyeglasses. Well, maybe an artifact like an eyeglass is not a great example from Socrates' point of view, but you might say, by virtue of what are these eyeglasses? Well, there must be something that all eyeglasses have in common, and that something is what it is to be an eyeglass. And so that is the form of an eyeglass. Now, I think what Socrates has in mind is something much more basic than that. We could talk about natural kinds, for example, human being, and talk about the form of humanity, what all human beings have in common. We could also talk about more abstract things. In fact, in some accounts of what Plato really had in mind, he has in mind forms that are much more abstract even than human being. Something like, for example, well, unity or difference, substance, the good. Very basic, very abstract forms. I think it's not so clear in the Republic that that's really what he has in mind. After all, he's talking about mathematical forms, and then these abstract forms, like the form of justice. And so we're going to have to put that question aside. But the essential point, from our point of view, and from his point of view here in Book 10, is that the ordinary objects of this world are not themselves the ultimate realities. They're something like shadows or reflections of the ultimate reality. They're copies of the ultimate reality, which is the forms. And so even the forms you might think of, and he suggests here in Book 10, are really ideas in the mind of God. And so the objects of this world are really copies of ideas in God's mind. Well, however that may be, they are at any rate copies. They're reflections. They are shadows of the ultimate realities. Now, what is a work of art? Well, it's a copy of a copy. Suppose you have a painting, for example, of some flowers, or a still life, some fruit, or for that matter, a portrait of a person. These things are not themselves the realities, you might say. Well, they're really copies, impressions, reflections. They are representations, we might say more abstractly, of those objects. A representation of flowers, or a representation of fruit and other things on a table, or a representation of a person. But of course, that makes them representations of shadows or reflections of the forms. So they're already at a couple of different removes. They are representations of a representation of a form. It's actually a little bit worse than that, because a work of art is something that really gives you one view of a representation of a representation. That is to say, when we have something like a representation of a person, or of some flowers, or of some fruit on a table, what we have there is one particular angle of things. We don't have the entire reality, even of that shadow or reflection. We have just one aspect of it. So consider, well, any kind of work of art. especially a painting. I think here, from his point of view, sculpture is a little bit better than painting, because sculpture at least allows us to walk around the sculpture and appreciate this representation of a representation from a variety of points of view. We can look at it from different angles and get some sense of what the object itself is like. But we can't do that in a painting or a drawing or a photograph, to get a little bit anachronistic here. What we get in a photograph or a painting or a drawing is one particular perspective on a shadow or a reflection, a copy, a representation. And so we really get something like a narrow slice of a representation of a representation. And the same thing is true in a work of literature. If we take a look at a work of literature, like here, The Tartar Steppe by Dino Buzzati, that's something that gives us one particular angle on a certain kind of circumstance. If you want, Buzzati here is describing a possible world, but he's giving us only one perspective on some aspects of that possible world. And so we've got certain aspects being represented in the book, aspects of a representation of a representation. So art and literature really doesn't give us the thing itself. It just gives us a perspective, an angle on a representation of a representation. So art and literature do not give us even as much as a representation of a representation. They give us something like a representation of one particular perspective on a representation of a reality. So we're several different steps away from the ultimate truth, from the ultimate reality. Socrates observes that there are three arts concerned with everything. Those three arts have to be distinguished, and once we distinguish them, we realize that the situation is maybe even a little bit worse than we thought. Now, why is that true? Well, he observes that the user's art, the makers, and the imitators are all distinct. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, the excellence, beauty, and rightness of anything, he says, pertains to its use. That is to say, the user understands what it is for a thing of a certain kind to be good. Let's think about that for a moment. The user of a thing knows what it is for a thing of that kind to be good. Socrates says that for each kind of thing, there are three distinct arts. There is the art, you might say, from the point of view of the user, from the point of view of the maker, and from the point of view of the imitator. And so there is a different sort of excellence for each. There is the excellence of the object from the point of view of the user. There is the excellence from the point of view of the maker. There is the excellence from the point of view of the imitator. And we can talk about these things as distinct and realize they're all separate arts. These do not come down to the same thing. Here, for example, is an object. It certainly displays a kind of excellence. It is a mid-90s Fortress 1 made by Warwick, and it's a really nice bass guitar. Well, from the user's point of view, there are certain things that make it a very good bass guitar. And so I can talk about its excellence from the point of view of a user, from the point of view of someone who plays bass guitar. The art of playing a guitar and of appreciating its excellence as a user, on the other hand, is very different from the excellence from the point of view of the maker. Now, the maker has to understand what a user will find excellent. And so the excellence from the maker's point of view and the excellence from the user's point of view are not really different. But the arts are different. The art of playing a bass guitar is very different from the art of making one. What you have to do to make an excellent bass guitar, well, I don't know really how to do that. I would have no idea how to do that. But then what about an imitator? Well, here I have in mind not so much someone who makes a copy or an imitation of a Warwick Fortress 1. Instead, what I have in mind is a different kind of imitation, the sort of imitation that would be involved in someone, let's say, making an artwork, producing a fine photograph, or a painting of a bass guitar, or maybe a sculpture of a bass guitar. Now again, is there the same kind of excellence here? Not really. You probably can't play the sculpture you can't play a painting or a photograph, and so it's not going to have an excellence from the user's point of view, or at least the user here is the viewer of the artwork, and that's going to be a very different conception from the conception of the person who's playing a bass guitar. And so already we can see the kind of excellence involved here is different, and the art of making it is certainly different. What would it take to sculpt a bass guitar or to paint one? I have no idea. But anyway, the excellence of the sculptor, the excellence of the painter, that's very different from the excellence of the maker of the guitar and the user of the guitar. And they're very different kinds of arts. Being good at playing a bass guitar does not at all entail that you would know how to make one, or that you would know how to sculpt one, or paint one, or even photograph one effectively. So these are different and distinct arts, and the excellence involved in them may or may not be the same. The user will typically communicate with the maker so that the maker understands excellence from the user's point of view and can make something that is excellent from a user's point of view. But now notice that the person who is producing an artwork, that's a different kind of excellence and a totally different kind of art. And in fact, the person who is photographing or sculpting or painting a guitar does not have to understand at all what would make it a good guitar from the point of view of the user. It's a completely different and independent art. And that's what bothers Socrates. Now, the same thing is true of literature. To write a story about a bass guitar or a bass guitar player, you really don't have to understand what it is to play one well or what it is to make one well. And so that is a completely different kind of excellence too. Well, if these arts are different, and if they're independent of the excellence of the object, then you realize that what's involved in producing a representation of a representation is not the same art as what is involved in producing the object itself or using it effectively. This means that art and literature, Socrates says, are fundamentally deceptive. Why? Because they use a kind of excellence and they employ a kind of art that are completely independent of the actual excellence of the object and the art involved in using or producing the object. What it takes to represent something effectively in an artistic or a literary way is independent of what it is to produce or to use that thing. And yet it gives people the impression they understand it. A remarkable example of this is when the Senate, a number of years ago, was having hearings on agricultural policy. And what did they do? They invited actors and actresses who had played farmers in movies to come and talk about farm policy. Well, to represent farming as an actor, for example, or to represent it in paintings or in photographs or in a film even, that has nothing to do with actual excellence of farming from a farmer's point of view or from the point of view of a consumer. So there's something absurd about this. But Socrates says that's exactly what these things encourage. They encourage people to focus on the representation rather than on the thing itself. And that is precisely what you don't want to do in the ideal state. The whole idea, he says, is that the soul has different parts. The rational part, which is what you would like to be in charge in the virtuous person and in the ideal state, but also an appetitive part, which is desire, and a spirited part, which is emotion. He says, here's the problem. Art and literature appeal primarily to desire and emotion. They strengthen the parts of the soul and the parts of the state that are not the ones you want in control. So he says, in the ideal state, it's not just a matter of having the right kind of art or the right kind of literature. He actually says you shouldn't have art, you shouldn't have literature. Music is okay, so no problem with music. But on the other hand, the other arts are going to have a kind of excellence that is going to not control and shape and direct desire and emotion in the way that music does. Instead, they're going to try to substitute something completely independent from them, something that weakens the rational part of the soul and encourages the spirited and appetitive parts the parts of the soul and the parts of the state that are potentially very dangerous. So Socrates says, in the ideal state, we can have music, but we cannot have art, we cannot have literature. They will strengthen the parts of the soul that we need to very carefully direct on the part of reason, and they will weaken reason's ability to do it. They will incline us to take the substitute for the real thing. They will incline us to take the representation of the representation, or really the representation of one particular perspective on the representation of the reality for the thing itself, and they'll lead us in that way into making serious mistakes and to undermining the virtues of the soul and the virtues of the state.